Welcome back, listeners. I'm glad you came back for another episode of Zombie Critters. I see that some of you have even brought some friends. My name is Jesse O'Brien, and I am your author and narrator on this trip. So, as we enter our story, I see that some of you have heeded my advice and brought some hand and leg protection. I also see a few have brought umbrellas and raincoats. It does look a little overcast, but let's hope it clears up. I would like to remind you that as we travel through this story that you do keep your hands to yourself and away from the mouths of the critters that we might encounter. Also, please remember not to feed any of the animals part of your carry-on or snacks. They might want more to eat than what you're willing to give them. This is your last chance to leave before we get into our story. Once the music ends, you're locked in, so to speak. The music is the only thing that allows us access in and out of our story dimension. It works in the same manner as that teleporting thing on Star Trek. It will only allow what we program in to either move in or move out of the story. Isn't that the cat's meow? Careful now as we step into the music room and into episode 2 of our story. A little bit more, please. Gather in close. That's right. When the music stops, the story will continue where we left off. Chapter 4. Oops! Gary and Tom were feverishly examining every sample they had. They had to examine the cat with the thick leather welding gloves to keep them from being bitten or scratched. Yes, the feline was breathing. It also had a very rapid pulse for a feline. They also noted that it had one of the fastest digestive systems Tom had ever seen. Tom drew blood from it for more study. Instead of a healthy red tint, this blood was very dark. Gary was observing samples from the dead cat when the phone rang. He ignored the irritation until it stopped, and then he looked at the caller ID. I guess they want to give us more victims, Gary said. We can't have anyone come here until we get control of what is going on, Tom said. Agreed, Gary concurred. Then his cell phone rang. Damn it, I forgot I had auto-forwarding just in case we weren't here. What happens if you don't answer, Tom asked. It will ring to your cell phone. After that, it goes to voicemail. By that time, they're sitting outside ready and waiting to drop them off, Gary said grimly. Better answer then. Again, agreed, Gary replied, and then he did the same to the cell phone. Gary here. Gary, how are you? This is Barnes from the shelter. I need to know how you guys are set for subjects. Gary noted a little nervous tension in his voice. You don't sound like your usual self. Are you okay? And just how many subjects are we talking about? We're still pretty full vacancy-wise. I think I can conservatively say around 300 various subjects from the canine to feline to possum, skunk, squirrel, chipmunk, gopher, mole, and... Gary cut him off. What's going on, Barnes? Did someone release all the animals and destroy their cages? Gary asked. Nope, I'm on site at an address and all these I have listed are transfixed on one residence like it was a shrine or something, Barnes said. I have to see this. Give me the address. We can take one animal. I will select the subject, and that's the best I can do. Sorry. Well, come and take your pick. As long as it's not tagged or chipped, then it will be yours. The other unchipped or tagged animals are going to have to be destroyed. There are just too many of them. Better hurry, though. I have every vehicle we have en route, Barnes said. We're on our way, then, Gary said. We need to secure these doors so they can't break in, Tom. We need to observe this report. I'm beginning to think this is connected somehow, Gary said. Well, let's go and select a subject and get back, Tom said, grabbing a carrier. They arrived just before the animal control teams went into action. They stood in total amazement at the intense focus of the animals to the house. Several police officers were standing around with their shotguns ready. The lieutenant walked over to Tom and Gary. Who are you two? And what are you doing here? This man was all business and wasn't going to allow any looky-loos to interfere with the police business or get hurt. We're students from Franklin College. Barnes called us to take the animals, but we can only take one. He told us to come and select it. Have you ever seen anything like this? The lieutenant shook his head. Whose house is that? Tom asked. Officer Taylor Smith. And no, he didn't cook anything. He went home with cold or flu symptoms, then was called to come in when he reported all the animals. Tom and Gary looked at each other as the lieutenant finished. Was he at Zach's apartment when they found his body? Tom asked. Lieutenant Hamilton turned and gave Tom a hard and suspicious look. And just how do you know about that? Just curious. It might be nothing, maybe a connection. Zach was working on a project parallel to ours. I think it was an attractant. I'm not sure. I'll have to go through his logs. Would we be able to get a blood sample from him? Tom asked. Up to him. Anyway, we have to get him out first. Just for shits and grins, we haven't heard from the other two that were bitten. One, strange but not out of character. The other we're getting ready to go over when we receive this report. So, here we are, Hamilton said. Pick a pooch, Gary. I'm tired of being clawed by cats. Tom and Gary turned back to Lieutenant Hamilton. Have any of these animals moved at all? A few have. I pulled up and bumped into several, and they turned and looked at me and then walked away like I'd broken some kind of trance, he said. This is really getting strange, Gary said, to no one in particular. Gary called Barnes. Officer Barnes here. Barnes, Gary. Hey, this is the most bizarre thing I've ever seen. Just select a medium-sized canine. They all look equally entranced for some reason. We'll wait for you. All right, people, suit up. Things might get aggressive, so be alert, Barnes announced to the other animal control officers. The first animal that was noosed broke trance and tried to get away, but did not attack. Most of the animals were docile. There were a few, though, that became very violent, but each one in turn broke trance after they were touched, not until then. It took around 4 hours to round up all the animals that were gathered at the house. All but a few had collars or were chipped. They quickly ran out of room at the facility. Because of the odd reaction to gathering at the house as if the Pied Piper himself had lured them there and left them hypnotized, the officers had no choice but to begin destroying them. Tom and Gary picked up a docile Labrador retriever. Taylor agreed to allow Tom to take a blood sample. Tom asked Taylor about what happened over the past 48 hours. They ended up with an additional bagged blanket to test as well. All right, boys, what the hell are you up to? You want to let me in on it, or am I going to have to come in with a search warrant and a scientist to figure out what you're up to, Hamilton said. Well, Zach was working on a rogue project to curb animal behavior, we think. That's why we're gathering samples to try to narrow down what he was doing, Tom said. If it was rogue, what are you guys working on? Hamilton asked. He really wasn't sure if he wanted to know the answer. Our project is based on human longevity, so to speak. If a person dies and they're given the medication that we're working on and developing, they can be brought back long enough to save them. Kind of like a jump starter that boosts the dead car battery long enough to have the charging system take over and recharge the battery, Gary explained. I knew I was going to regret asking that question. Get out of here before I get some insane idea that somehow you're responsible for all this, Hamilton said. Tom and Gary took Lieutenant Hamilton's advice, made themselves scarce. They did not need to be told twice. Once back at the lab, they ran tests on the dog and found the normal, healthy dog. Taylor's blood was normal, except that there was a strange antigen mixed in with it. Other than that, it was normal. They compared the blood samples of the lab and Taylor against Zach and the cats. Then they tested those results against the animals in the laboratory. Zach's blood had a strange virus that was similar to the ones in the dead cats and the animals that had been exposed to the formula. Then they made a discovery that made their blood chill. The blood in the exposed animals were not able to sustain any life. After observing a cat, dog, and squirrel they managed to rescue from the lab, their heartbeats all raced at double the normal rate of that species, and the digestive system also. However, everything almost came to a dead halt when there was nothing to digest. The animals infected only ate the internal organs and brains, if they could gain access to the cranium, that is. By the end of the day, they had made volumes of notes and just as many unanswered questions. They needed to take samples from the other officers to see if there was a consistency to Officer Taylor or if they had a similar situation to Zach. So far, they had theorized that it might be spread by humans, but only when the human was feeling ill with a cold or flu-like symptom. But when the person developed an immunity and overcame the virus, they were still in question on just how the virus spread from man to animal. They knew very little of cross-infection of illnesses between different species. The bird flu is one such example. There were still too many questions, and some of those questions were about to get some very strange answers. Chapter 5. Oh, the humanity! Lieutenant Hamilton and Officer Taylor Smith drove over to Officer Mike Milligan's residence. There was a small crowd and an ambulance in the driveway of the Milligans' house and several squad cars. The lieutenant turned on his lights and stopped out front. They exited the cruiser and pushed through the crowd. Taylor saw an unsecured sight and removed a shotgun from a track. Hamilton pulled his sidearm and they approached the house. They talked briefly to the officer in charge on site and were informed that they could get no reply from inside the home. Smith and Hamilton walked around the house and saw officers posted at each corner with shotguns. Looking in the kitchen window, they could see blood everywhere but no sign of life. Taylor tried the back door as Hamilton covered him. It was locked. They went back around to the front of the house where Hamilton thought better of his 9mm and acquired an officer's shotgun. They found the front door unlocked and slowly entered the home searching for any sign of Tank. Mike was spread out on the floor face up at the base of the stairs. He'd been ripped open and disemboweled as Zach was. His skull had been crushed and was empty. They made their way into the kitchen and found Peggy in the same condition. Hamilton felt a wave of nausea flush over him as he witnessed the carnage before him. Officers were slowly entering and clearing the downstairs room by room, but the dog had yet to be found. Taylor began the trek of ascending the stairs and seeing evidence that this had been the beginning of Milligan's demise. Taylor had stopped and motioned for another officer to come up. He pointed up to his ear to listen. Heavy breathing could be heard from somewhere downstairs. They continued upstairs almost back to back as they crested the top of the stairs. The table was behind the railing and was knocked over, and the breathing was coming from behind it. Taylor stepped left while the other officer stepped right. Tank stood up and growled. He was immersed in blood. The officer's shot hit his spine, and Tank spun as if he'd been stung by a bee. Only his rear leg stopped working. Taylor's shot took most of his skull and scattered it all over the floor, table, and wall. The body was still thrashing when Taylor put another round of buckshot into Tank's heart. They finished clearing the upstairs and went downstairs to report to Hamilton. Lieutenant Hamilton made a phone call. Rang as he compiled his recent findings. "Tom here. Lieutenant Hamilton here. I need you to come out here and tell me just what the hell is going on. I have a dead officer, his wife's dead, and possibly his daughter." He gave the address. "I will give you exactly 1/2 hour before my boys come to you and drag you down here. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" Hamilton was very angry, and Tom did not want anyone there until they could gain control of the front lab once again. "Yes, sir, we're on our way," he said. 20 minutes later, Tom and Gary were rolling up on an obvious crime scene. They were immediately met by Hamilton, who took them inside, and where Gary, upon looking at the gore, promptly vomited, irritating Hamilton even more. "Any ideas?" Hamilton said. Tom, tearing his gaze away from Peggy's destroyed remains, looked at Hamilton and said, "Sir, what we have so far is a theory, and right now this theory is looking really solid. Problem is, everybody in here is exposed to a virus. This virus will give symptoms like a cold or the flu. Now, when an animal comes into contact, but we don't know how yet, the animal is also infected. But instead of becoming ill, the animal becomes very aggressive. They also seem to devour only the entrails and brains. They don't touch muscle, marrow, or bone unless it is to access what is within. We need to take some samples," Tom concluded. "Samples? Samples? There are samples for you everywhere. Take your pick. What are you doing? Writing a science fiction novel? Go and buy that Timmy novel from that hack Jesse O'Brien and curl up with some tea and frickin' crumpets. So, what you're telling me is a human with a cold sneezes and turns an animal into a zombie or something like that?" Hamilton was not only turning dark red, but also losing control. Tom stayed calm. It could be possible, but they still have a heartbeat and digestive activity. Howbeit, the heartbeat and digestive activity speeds up 2 times faster if they are or have just eaten, Gary said. "You guys are coming with me," Hamilton hissed. "Lieutenant, we need to get the names of everyone inside. Have they found the daughter yet?" Tom asked. "Why? You want to take samples?" Tom nodded shyly. "And no, they've not found Sadie yet to answer the other question. There should be a mop to gather your samples with here somewhere." Tom wondered if the lieutenant were going to have an aneurysm before the day was done. Hamilton delegated the name collection to another officer while Tom and Gary quickly gathered some random samples. Hamilton, Smith, Gary, and Tom entered the cruiser and drove over to Tom Strader's apartment. The car was silent save the frantic scratching in notebooks from Tom and Gary. They arrived at his address and went to his door. Taylor knocked and got no answer. They tried the knob, but it was locked. Taylor found the manager and gained access. Tom Strader sat, or rather, Tom Strader's husk, sat in front of the TV. There were literally thousands of roaches crawling in and around him, but instead of scrambling for cover, they made for the men in the doorway. The manager slammed the door and looked at the four others in what was obviously confusion. Gary took his jacket and blocked the bottom of the door while they made their exit. Back at the car, the silence was broken with, "Shit! Roaches too? Zombie roaches of Indiana. They used to be reported as the only thing that could survive a nuclear attack. Now, nothing but a boot can kill them. What the hell, guys? What are we looking at? How much further can this spread?" Hamilton asked. Tom and Gary shrugged their shoulders. "We're still researching, Lieutenant." Gary, but this was cut off by Hamilton. I know. More samples." He was speaking sarcastically, doing a poor imitation of Tom. "We need to get some of those bugs and samples from Tank, right?" Yeah, Tom said. "It is how we do research." "Fine," he said sarcastically, and walked back into the apartment. "Pull a little gap in your coat and collect what comes out. I'm not going back in there without an exterminator." "Agreed," Gary said. Tom opened a small gap and was rewarded with a flood of roaches. They were able to collect a large and heavy zip-top bag full of the little carnivores. They plugged the hole and killed what was roaming about or chasing them. Hamilton was the worst affected. He stomped hard and twisted like he was doing an old version of the twist, with one exception. He had a string of epithets to go with each stomp. Shit, seriously, freaking zombie cockroaches? Damn, shit, fire, save the matches, shit! Tom wanted to laugh, but knew better in lieu of the situation. Instead, he commented, "I think that's all of them. We should get back," Tom said. Hamilton stomped all the way to the door, and even with the lack of the things, found himself stomping intermittently on the way back to the cruiser. To say that he had a case of the willies would have been a gross understatement. They got to the car where Lieutenant Hamilton was still uncontrollably convulsing occasionally. Tom thought all the way back. It was really a futile effort to block the door. The insects had gotten in somehow, and his apartment wasn't dirty, so all those roaches did not have enough food on the average to sustain their existence. They would exit from whence they entered. Then what? None of this still made any sense whatsoever. On the surface, it looked as though the animals and insects were infected directly by injection, inhalation, droplet, contact, and vapor. Humans were the perfect incubators, and also the ultimate buffet. "Officer Smith," Tom said in deep thought, "you were bitten at Zach's apartment, correct?" "That's correct," he replied. Tom didn't think that he would like the next volley. "You're still alive. I take it you don't own pets or have problems with pests?" Tom asked. "Last time I checked, I was still alive. I'm not home often enough to own pets, and I had tended the house for termites and anything else that moves in the house. So, no pests," he replied. "I would love to know what drew the animals like that," Tom asked, to no one in particular. "I've been asking the same question ever since it started," Smith said, but he sounded more concerned than he let on. "Not to mention that they seemed entranced and not aggressive at all when disturbed, except for a few." Tom noted that as well. Whatever Taylor did to attract them, but did not turn them, Tom was seeing a pattern emerging, but it still made little to no sense. Back at the apartment, the roaches were getting hungry. They had gone out the same way they had come in. They sensed food in other parts of the building. It wasn't as alluring as what had opened the door, but food was food. The apartment next door had fallen victim first. The baby's room was just on the other side of the wall, and the mother was once again strung out on crack. The baby began to cry as the first of the roaches started to crawl and bite on the exposed skin. The mother screamed, slammed the door to the room, lighted a cigarette, and stepped to the window and stared out into the street. The screaming intensified as the mother placed her hands on the sides of her face, pulling at her ears and her hair, begging the powers that be that the damn little nuisance of a mistake would just shut the hell up. Then she noted a sudden blissful silence in the apartment. She sat, put her head down, hating her very existence. She couldn't take care of herself, let alone a baby, but here she was. Her mom was a welfare retiree, 6 children. She lived well enough, though she never really recalled ever seeing her mother sober. She needed a fix. She reached her hand out and drew back a stained glass tube. She loaded it and heated the contents, inhaling the white vapors that emanated from the little rock inside the tube. Feeling the effects of the drugs coming on, she put the tube and lighter down. Seeing a roach crawling toward her on the table, she killed the bug with a fervor that showed another aspect of her miserable existence. She got up and moved to the couch as the drugs really began to affect her already unstable mental state. She curled into the fetal position and looked at nothing. In her altered drug-induced fog, she saw what looked like hundreds, thousands of roaches seemingly coming from the baby's room. Something in her took over that some would call a sudden urge of motherly instinct. She jumped up, almost falling over the couch, and ran through the carpet of roaches to the baby's room and threw open the door, only to begin her own wave of panic screams. In the crib was layer upon layer of roaches with the shape of a baby underneath. It was as if the baby was covered in a living blanket. Another sensation gripped her and made her jump. The roaches were climbing up and biting her legs. She ran from the room and out of her apartment, ripping at her pants to get them off, killing what roaches that clung to her. Clad in nothing but a shirt and panties, she ran until she was reported to the police, and they came to take her in. The police interviewed her and went back to check on her story. What they witnessed on arrival was anything but routine. During the girl's pantless trek down the block, the apartment on the other side of Tom Strader was a fastidious neat freak. She loathed the apartment, the dregs that lived there, the pests, the roaches, the flies, the mice, the lice. She hated it all, but she was forced to stay on for many reasons. But the big three was no money, no friends, and no money. She saw one roach fall to the floor from a cabinet door and walk in her direction. She blinked, looked again, and got up to mash the little bastard into a fine paste, in which she did with a combination of disgust and a smirk of sick satisfaction knowing it was dead. She moved to get a paper towel when the cabinet once again drew her attention. The door actually bumped and then hung open a little as roaches began to literally pour from the cabinet. Reaching under the sink, she grabbed the industrial-sized can of bug killer and took aim. She coated every last one as they emerged from the cabinet. She began backing away as she realized that the spray was having no effect whatsoever on the assaulting pests. She grabbed her lighter from the stove and sprayed the advancing roaches and ignited the spray. This did have the desired effect. It killed the roaches, but it worked too well. Everywhere she had sprayed contained a highly flammable residue of bug spray, and it caught and burned intensely. Soon the apartment was in flames, and a woman ran out to get away from the roaches and the fire. The apartment was old and was built when they used wood for everything. The building was around 90 years old. The weak, very old, very dry, very termite-ridden wood, lighted like the effigy at the Burning Man celebration. When the officers arrived, the top 3 floors are fully involved, and the bottom 2 floors are going to join in before the fire crew could arrive. They radioed the fire dispatch and were informed that the fire was already en route. People were screaming and running from the building. Within minutes, the roof and the floors collapsed, leaving nothing but the fuel to feed the flames from the first floor and remains of the second. The officers then heard sirens in the distance. The fire department arrived and hooked up to the hydrant while the captain evaluated the scene, and rapidly ascertained that the structure was a total loss and ordered the adjoining structures hosed to keep them cool and as safe as possible to keep them from flaring up. This command was very prudent on his part in lieu of not knowing about the zombie roach debacle. The few strays that did make it outside were trampled in the throes of the people running away from the burning building. Some blessings are never recognized or even known to anyone in particular. Well now, I don't know about you, but I have a serious case of the willies now. Not really a nice way to go for Officer Tom and Officer Mike's family. I wonder if the little girl got out okay. I guess we'll find out next week now, won't we? If you like what you're hearing, look me up on Facebook as Jess O'Brien. I am posting out of Indianapolis, Indiana. Look into my notes section and see what I'm up to. I also have several teasers and other works, well, in the works. I will see you next time, and thank you for listening.